Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. In this podcast, we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're excited to welcome three wonderful guests, Professor Koga Kei, Shiozawa Hideyuki and Dr. Euan Graham, to discuss Japan and the Pacific Island countries. Before we get into the discussion, I would like to introduce our esteemed guests. First, Professor Koga Kei is Associate Professor and Head of Division at the Public Policy and Global Affairs Programme at the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, NTU. Kei is also Non-Resident Fellow at the National Bureau of Asia Research in the US, NBR, in the US, and a member of the Research Committee at the Research Institute for Peace and Security in Japan. His research focuses on international security, international regional institutions, particularly ASEAN, and East Asian Indo-Pacific security. He's published on topics including East Asian Indo-Pacific security, US and Japan foreign policies, the US-Japan alliance, and ASEAN. Kei's latest publication is Tactical Hedging as Coalition Building Signal, the Evolution of Quad and AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Kei.
Thank you for having me.
And our second speaker is Shiozawa Hideyuki, who is Senior Program Officer and Program Director of the Pacific Islands Nation Program Team at the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Previously, Hideyuki served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan as First Secretary at the Embassy of Japan in Fiji and at the Embassy in the Marshall Islands as Economic Advisor in charge of economic cooperation and politics. He was also Program Officer at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and JICA Volunteer Teacher in the Marshall Islands. He's been involved in over 70 ODA projects and 20 Sasakawa Peace Foundation projects in the Pacific Island countries. He's also been involved in a number of political dialogues since 2003. Welcome, Hideyuki.
Thank you so much.
And our third guest is Dr. Euan Graham, who is Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, known as ASPI. He joined ASPI in July 2023. During his career, Euan has focused on Australia's regional security environment, working for think tanks in Australia, Singapore, and the UK. Before joining ASPI, Euan worked with us here at the IISS at the IISS Asia office in Singapore, where he was closely involved in organising the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, an annual summit of defence ministers from across the Indo-Pacific region. Euan has published extensively on a broad range of defence and security topics, including for the IISS, one of our books in our Adelphi series called Australia's Security in China's Shadow, which came out in 2023. Welcome, Euan.
Thanks, Robert. Nice to be back with you.
First, let's take a look at Japan's policy in the South Pacific. The strategic importance of the South Pacific region has increased in recent years as the islands in the region provide key access points to vital sea lanes of communication. The value of relations with the Pacific Island countries in the region is also increasing as China's influence in the region grows, with rapidly increasing investments by China in the region, including military and security activities too. Japan is one of the countries also increasing its engagement in the region. Japan has historical ties with the Pacific Island countries. So our first question to you, Kei. In your report called Japan's Strategic Approach Towards Island States, Case of the Pacific Islands, you mentioned four different interests that Japan has in the region. They are economic interests, which is fishing rights and natural resources, protection of sea lanes of communication, diplomatic interests, that's international fora such as the UN, and security interests. Given these elements, Kei, how has Japan formulated its strategic approach to the Pacific Island countries?
Any strategic approach is nurtured by the country's national interests, fishing rights, the sea lines of communication, and the diplomatic interests to gain support from the Pacific Island countries regarding such initiative as the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And also, more importantly, the Pacific Islands region is in the geostrategically important areas. The Pacific Island countries are located between the United States, Australia, and Japan. And in the past, Japan fought in the Battle of the Guadalcanal during the 1942 and 43 to cut the defense linkage between the United States and Australia. Today, if China controls this area, it would not only create a strategic challenge for Japan, the US and Australia, but also extend China's power projection capabilities toward the Pacific Oceans. To ensure all the different kinds of the interest, Japan's general strategic approach is founded on the Kuranari Doctrine, launched by the Foreign Minister Tadashi Kuranari in 1987. This doctrine includes the 5 principles. 1 is the respect for independence and self-help. 2 is support for regional cooperation. 3, ensuring political stability. Fourth, economic cooperation for development. Fifth, the promoting the people-to-people exchange. So building on this, Japan has created the two-pronged strategic approach toward the Pacific Island countries, bilateral and multilateral. Bilaterally, Japan provides economic assistance tailored to the needs of each Pacific Island countries. Generally, this assistance includes humanitarian aid, disaster relief, sustainable development and climate change initiatives, and infrastructure development. This economic aid is typically given as grants, not loans, due to the underdeveloped economic foundations of the Pacific Island countries. And multilaterally, Japan launched the Pacific Island Leaders Meeting, PALM, in 1997. This platform institutionalized the triennial summit meeting between Japan and Pacific Island countries. By maintaining communication channels, facilitating information exchanges, and understanding common interests, Japan aims to cultivate strong diplomatic relations with these countries, and this platform is particularly useful for gaining diplomatic support for the initiative like for free and open in the Pacific. Through these approaches, Japan aims to enhance the resiliency of strategic autonomy of the Pacific Island countries. Interestingly, these approaches are very similar to Japan's engagement with the ASEAN and Southeast Asia.
Interesting. Kei mentioned free and open Indo-Pacific concept, FOIP. Hideyuki, I just want to turn to you now, if I may, given that you've had experience of working on the ground with the Japanese government in the region. FOIP is essentially a sort of maritime policy framework that came in response to China's threat to the existing rules-based order in the region. And as Kei said, the South Pacific is a geostrategically important area for Japan and for others, and it's also important under FOIP. But only 5 countries in the region, Fiji, the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and Papua New Guinea, openly support FOIP. Hideyuki, how do Pacific Island countries view Japan's presence in the region?
Basically, Japan is traditional partner to the Pacific Island countries over 4 decades or 5 decades. From the Pacific Island countries' view, Japan is like an alternative option or development partner to US, Australia, and New Zealand. But after FOIP, Japan's stance is very close to US, Australia, and New Zealand. After FOIP, Pacific Island countries recognize Japan is not between Pacific Island countries and those former sovereign countries, but Japan is with them. That is the point. Regarding the FOIP, in 2018, at Palm 8, Japanese government tried to get support about Japan's FOIP from Pacific Island countries. But for this Palm 10, since mid-2023, last year, Japanese government stopped using the term FOIP to Pacific Island countries. But talking about the rules-based order, after the Palm 10, we found out all the Pacific Island countries who joined this Palm 10 jointly had a consensus to support rules-based order, but not FOIP.
Do you think that FOIP has not been successful as a concept in the region then? FOIP has been exported, if you like, beyond the region. So the US has got Indo-Pacific strategy, some European countries as well. So in a sense, FOIP has taken root in some respects outside the region. But what you're saying is that among the Pacific Island countries, this has been less successful.
The vision is same, but Japan was carefully not to be involved in US-China competition. And when we use term FOIP, the Pacific Island countries is thinking FOIP is a countermeasure to China's BRI. So Japan stopped using FOIP, but they're talking about the contents or tangible actions.
Kei, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. I think that's right. If we look at the joint statement of the Palm 10, which was just held in July, it doesn't actually say about the free and open in the Pacific. But interestingly, like if we take a look at the memorandum or the statement made by the Foreign Minister of Japan, it says in the working ranch, Prime Minister Kishida actually they mentioned about free and open in the Pacific. So I think like there is a diplomatic effort for Japan to strike the delicate balance between how Japan wants to actually push forward the principles of FOIP and then also maintaining FOIP as a strategic doctrine for Japanese diplomacy.
Euan, I could see you nodding there. Do you want to add something?
Well, just to amplify what Shiozawa-san has already said, my impression is that Japan has realized that it's probably premature to expect formal recognition from the Pacific Island states of the FOIP concept. Rather, the more sensible and less friction approach is to unpack it, take the rules-based order, parts of it out, and allow the region to assimilate it in its own way, rather than being seen in the shadow of a counter BRI strategy. Tokyo has been on a learning curve there and realised that the Pacific needs to move at its own pace.
Follow-on question for you, Euan. You're sitting there today in Australia. I'd be interested to hear your views on how Japan's diplomatic efforts in the region have been received or projected onto Japanese like-minded partners and allies such as Australia.
Briefly, they're welcomed. In a geostrategic sense, I think the Western Pacific is the key part of the Indo-Pacific where the competition is most intense. Japan sits as the most important US ally in terms of the US military footprint and its own capacities in the north. Australia is the southern anchor. Because of its proximity to the South Pacific, there is an obvious common interest for the reasons that Kei outlined, including sea lines of communication. I mean, there are some differences. Australia is a Pacific Island Forum member, unlike Japan. So I think the emphasis of Australia is very much to avoid the dilution of the PIF, as it's known for short. While Japan's efforts, I think, are very welcome, there's always some concern that the proliferation of high-level summits, and this isn't only Japan, by the way, Korea held its own first inaugural Pacific Island Summit, I think, earlier this year. Washington has also brought Pacific Island leaders, and the strains of that, I think, on a crowded calendar, and given the logistical difficulty of moving Pacific Island leaders to foreign locations, the emphasis is on trying to make the PIF the centerpiece for assistance. And that speaks to the obvious importance of deconfliction in efforts. So while the efforts are welcomed, Canberra would like to see them deconflict, and even like-minded partners don't always consult, not through malice, but just simply it's difficult to line up and coordinate activities sometimes, partly because Japan is on the outside of the PIF process itself. The question really that comes to my mind is, what is the smart division of labour between Australia and Japan? Japan has Pacific equities in enormous capacity. Australia has the geographical proximity and also the very close relationship, and particularly with the Melanesian countries. So I suppose Japan's equities are strongest in Micronesia. Australia is strongest in Melanesia, but I don't think it's a straightforward line down the map division of labour. I think there are things that Japan brings. For example, in the Solomon Islands, where Australian influence has very much been sort of under direct challenge from China, Japan's probably the second most important post in the Solomon Islands. I think it can probably step forward a bit. If there's a sort of classic Japanese reticence about wanting to say what it does, sometimes that holds Japan's diplomacy back, in my view, not only in the Pacific Island. I think it's true elsewhere, but Japan could be a bit more front-footed and a bit more vocal about what it does, because the competition, namely China, has no such inhibitions.
A follow-on question to Hideyuki. Euan talked about a smart division of labour between Australia and Japan, and that Japan needs to speak about its achievements a bit more loudly. But on the smart division of labour between Australia and Japan, where do you see the opportunities there for the Japanese government?
Japanese government doesn't do anything new to Solomon Islands. We just keep working along with our policy, especially for human resource development. Japan's role would be not to work alone. Hopefully, Japan can foster or facilitate some kind of coordination involving Solomon Island government among development partners, not to exclude China. All the development partners should work together for the development of the Solomon Islands. That is what the government of Solomon Islands needs, I think.
That point about not excluding China is also key to FOIP more broadly, isn't it? FOIP is open to everybody. I think that's a point that sometimes gets lost in the discussion of Japanese policy in the region. Turning to security, which we've been talking about a little bit, Japan's security cooperation in the region is growing quite quickly. In terms of capacity building, Japan's decided to provide official security assistance to Fiji and reportedly to Papua New Guinea as well. Japanese Coast Guard has increased its involvement in the region too. Tokyo launched the Mobile Cooperation Team in 2017 to help improve the capabilities of foreign Coast Guard organizations, including 4 countries in the South Pacific, so Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Kiribati. And in July, the MCT was deployed for the first time to Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. And Japan hosted the second Japan-Pacific Islands Defense Dialogue in March this year as well. So, Kei, question for you, please. Why is Japan increasing its defense cooperation with the Pacific Islands? And how do the Pacific Island countries view Japan's increasing security role in the region?
I think the Japan's defense cooperation is a recent phenomenon, but it stems from 2 main reasons. One is functional, and the other one is strategic. The functional reason is to enhance the Pacific Island countries' defense and law enforcement capabilities to deal with non-traditional security issues. The concept of security in the Pacific Island region is pretty broad, as it faces transnational issues, particularly those stemming from climate change and natural disasters. Given that the not so resilient infrastructure of the Pacific Island countries, the impact of the natural disasters and their economic consequences are pretty severe. For example, the Tonga's, the volcano eruptions, and tsunami in 2022 had a negative economic impact of about $182 million, which was around 36% of its GDP. Addressing humanitarian crises and disaster relief requires defense capabilities and cooperation. Japan promotes the capacity building program for them. Climate change causing sea level rise would result in the loss of landmass, which is existential crisis for their national security. And additionally, irregular, unreported, and regulated so-called IUU fishing leads to the loss of the economic resources for those countries. Which necessitates maritime domain awareness, MDA, and law enforcement capabilities. So as the impacts of these non-traditional security issues become so severe over time, Japan has enhanced its defense cooperation with the Pacific Island countries. In this division, Japan's definition of defense, to be sure, is also quite broad because only 3 countries possess the military, namely Tonga, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea, while the rest have some law enforcement agencies. To address non-traditional security issues, it is important to promote intra-sectoral cooperation between the defense and law enforcement sectors to gain a more precise understanding of the needs and the demands of the Pacific Island countries. Japan held, as you said, the Japan-Pacific Islands Defense Dialogue, JPIDD, in 2021 and 2024, and is now trying to create an institutional linkage with PALM and South Pacific Defense Ministers Meeting, SPDMM. For Japan, the other stakeholders are important. So the Western countries like the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So by inviting them, who has the really historically long ties with the Pacific Island countries, Japan aimed to enhance dialogues with the regional countries and promote their security capabilities. Lastly, the other reason, the strategic one, relates directly to China's growing security influence in the region. In the past decades, China has enhanced its security relation with Pacific Island countries, notably the Solomon Islands. Given China's strong non-interference principle, it can easily cooperate with the non-democratic states that violate human rights, which counters this principle of the existing international order. This diplomatic stance can attract cooperation from non-democratic countries in the region, creating the new sphere of influence in the Pacific. It has the strategic implication for the region. And in this context, Japan aims to provide the regional countries with more options and perspective for enhancing their defense and security capabilities to prevent them from relying on one particular power. And I think from the Pacific Island countries' perspective, more option is actually better for security and policy as well. So I think those kind of initiatives are welcome.
Euan, you want to jump in?
Thanks, Robert. I think it might be useful for listeners to understand that there are only 3 Pacific Island countries that formally have armed forces: Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Tonga. So that's obviously a considerable restraint on the formality of defense-to-defense relations. And Japan has been inhibited, I think, by that protocol on the part of the Japan Defense Ministry that precluded defense relationship with the other Pacifics. I think the key to opening that door is official security assistance, which you mentioned at the top is already likely to be given to Fiji and Papua New Guinea. But I think it will go wider. My understanding is that Japan is behind a move to make OSA Pacific-wide, which I think is appropriate, to making sure that it isn't artificially hidebound by that defense-to-defense ministry protocol issue.
Let's turn now to geopolitical competition in the Pacific. We've been talking about some of the things that China is doing in the region, and the political importance of the Pacific Island countries also has a Taiwan element to it. I think 3 of the 12 countries that recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state are in the region: Palau, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. China's put pressure on Taiwan's allies, resulting in the Solomon Islands and Kiribati switching their political ties in 2019. So lots going on in the region for China as well. Hideyuki, how's China increasing its political capital in the region?
First of all, we have to look at the economic situation of each Pacific Island country. Before switching Kiribati and Solomon Islands in 2019, those 2 countries' economic growth were lowest in the region. They need to find some chance to step up their economic level. That is the chance for mainland China to approach. I don't know, is there any clear division between public sector and private sector in China? But when I visited those countries before switching, I saw many private sector, like small shops owned by Chinese people. This was not successful, but in Palau, the private sector is deeply related to tourism sector. We saw the increase of Chinese tourists in Palau to dominate the market. I saw some situation also in Kiribati. Solomon is a little bit different, but mainland China use private sector first, then dominate the private sector, then ask another step to sign some kind of investment agreement or trade agreement to increase the volume of those economic relationship. But there's a condition. Chinese side ask that government stop recognizing Taiwan.
Euan, you've written on China's influencing activity in Australia. How does Australia view what China's doing politically in the region? Where does Australia sort of sit strategically on that?
Australia has always seen itself as the predominant power in the Southwest Pacific. It has a very different approach to the immediate region to its east than it does, say, in Southeast Asia, where there's a much greater interplay of including bigger actors. That sort of cast a particular shadow on the intensity of the competition with China, because Australia often sees itself as the security partner of first choice. And I think that still is the case with the bigger Pacific Island countries in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea in particular. There's no doubt that China has brought a very rude awakening to Australian complacency, frankly, that a lot of that assumption that Australia has ties that give it effective primacy by default is no longer the case. As Hideyuki has said, I think you have to look at the economics to understand that China is offering to fill gaps that Australia can't do. It has many dimensions. When you're competing against China, it is a full spectrum set of policy challenges, including the military strategic dimension. The worry in the national security and defense circles in Australia is not so much that China is going to appear tomorrow with an island base in the Solomon Islands with a fully fledged battle fleet, but rather it has a long-term interest in gaining a presence in the second island chain, leapfrogging the so-called first island chain where the US is still the preponderant power, and that grand strategy is motivating a lot of the activity that we see, jostling for influence, the interest in infrastructure, even in things like submarine cables, which are now being rediscovered as real strategic assets because they control the flow of information, often almost a monopoly status in some of these small island nations, and that's brought Australia having to make better offers and counter offers and bring government to lead in a way that the private sector is not necessarily motivated to do because commercially it doesn't make sense. So it's back to quite a sort of statist view of relations. Briefly, however, just one caveat important to that. In the Pacific, of course, if you ask most islanders what their threat perception is, they'll uniformly say climate change. So there is a dissonance between the chessboard view of the world and the importance of China when actually, for a lot of these nations, they're facing facing what they see as an existential threat that's not geopolitical in nature primarily. They're looking over the horizon for the next storm, literally, rather than the metaphorical geopolitical ones.
Kei, Euan mentioned China leapfrogging the first island chain and taking a foothold in the second island chain. And clearly this has a big, in Euan's words, sort of chessboard strategic element to it. How do you evaluate how successful China's been in military security aspect of its strategy in the region?
I think it's been relatively successful assessing China's strategy toward the Pacific Island countries. It doesn't clearly say what China really wants because of policy vagueness, but at the same time, China grows its influence economically and security and military-wise in the Pacific Islands. China's strategy is working, and particularly when we look at China's economic influence, as Yuan and then Shiozawa-san said, China knew that Pacific Islands wants to have economic assistance to maintain or develop its infrastructure or economy. China could actually provide some of the economic assistance without considering the so-called international standard, so that they don't actually worry too much about the political system or environmental consequences. This actually helps the Pacific Islands to get the economic assistance without any severe conditions. This actually created the Chinese diplomatic influence as well. The diplomatic recognition toward Taiwan actually changed a lot. I think the Pacific Islands changes over time. For example, in the 2002, Nauru cut its ties with Taiwan to switch to China, but in 2005, it changed again to Taiwan. Kiribati cut its ties with China and switched to Taiwan in 2003. In the early 2000s, 6 countries, Kiribati, Nauru, the Marshall Islands, Palau, the Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu, had ties with Taiwan. But in 2019, the Solomon Islands and Kiribati decided to switch their ties to China, and in 2024, Nauru again cut its diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So now, Taiwan has diplomatic ties with only 3 Pacific Island countries, so that by increasing diplomatic influence with the Pacific Island countries, China could impose diplomatic pressure on Taiwan. So in that sense, overall, I think China's strategy is pretty successful. This is not actually the intent. They actually act depending on the trend of strategic situation in the region and also the international circumstances. China's strategic interests evolve over time. If there is an opportunity, they would seize it. And if not, aim to gradually increase influence through socio-economic assistance. The strategic trend worked to some extent.
Euan.
Yes, I think that's right. There are targets of opportunity, as it were, that present themselves that China has taken. I think the Solomon Islands was a big wake-up call for Australia and indeed the rest of the region. Although Australia still has significant leverage and influence with the Solomon Islands, it's not an exclusive relationship that it has with China. The fact that it concluded a treaty-level secret security agreement with China was a very big change-up factor. And I think the game that China's been playing essentially is elite capture. And elite capture in the Pacific can work because the sums that are involved are trivial from China's standpoint. It doesn't take much for that economic opportunity to present itself. We also see a lot of flux in the Pacific. The Palm Summit, one of the things I think that probably Japan couldn't have predicted was that New Caledonia would have been a major focus at the Palm Summit because it was topical, and not because Japan put it on the agenda, but because the security crisis in New Caledonia presented itself. That has come very rapidly. We may even see in the future a potential opening there for China to try and fill space that's vacated by France to some degree. And that can happen with surprising speed. Japan's also had a metaphorical shot across its bows just in this last month. I'd be interested if either of our other guests have anything to say on this. There was a Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces vessel that was due to visit Port Vila in Vanuatu, and it was denied clearance to visit, even though it was a medical ship. Coinciding with that, the Prime Minister of Vanuatu was in Beijing. Similar things have happened with the US being denied clearance for its naval vessels to pass through Solomon Islands waters. Even Japan, although it's attempting to frame its strategy in a way that doesn't demand exclusivity or denial of China, China, of course, wants to deny Japan. Certainly a direct defense role is the inference to draw from that incident, but it's open to interpretation.
Hideyuki, I've got a question for you, and I want to turn to the sort of the outlook as we move to the Japan Memo questions in a minute. Interesting point that Euan raises on the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force ship being denied clearance in Vanuatu, and also relating to the point that we've been making over the course of the podcast about countries in this region not wanting to have to choose between China and the US. If you were sitting in MOFA in Tokyo as foreign minister, would you think you'd need to recalibrate Japanese strategy towards the region? Where do you think the most productive areas are for Japan to engage with the region? I mean, we talked about climate change, as, for example, as the biggest security issue from the point of view of the region. Is there anything that you would do to course correct or tweak policy?
In Japan, when we talk about security in the region, people think of region-wide security, like 14 Pacific countries are same. We recommend to our government side that we should look at the security order in the region to be multi-layered one. In the north, above the equator, when we talk about security with Palau, FSM, and Marshall Islands, when we talk about the case of Taiwan contingency, they are serious about that. When we talk about Taiwan contingency, we can talk on the same stage with those three countries. When I talk same thing to the 11 countries in the south, it's a little bit different. When we talk about security in the south, it will be more like humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and climate change also. If I were in MOFA, I will recommend our government to work not simply, but make some kind of multi-layered strategy. The target will be also different.
So to sort of differentiate Japan's offer to the region a bit. And Kei, how do you think that Japan should position itself in the region if, as one assumes, Sino-US rivalry is something that's going to be with us for quite a while?
I think Japan should facilitate what I call strategic empowerment for the Pacific Island countries. This is actually a concept I created and then discussed in my recent articles titled Strategic Empowerment, Japan's Evolving Policy Towards Southeast Asia from the 2010s. Essentially, this concept refers to promoting the enhancement of economic, political, and security capacities of the target countries, contributing to ensuring their strategic autonomy. And at the same time, those who engage in the strategic empowerment aims to nurture relationship to share a strategic objective and means to achieve them. And Japan's strategic objective is to maintain and enhance the existing rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, as stipulated its policies documents. To this end, Japan's task is to guide the Pacific Island countries to share this broad objective and cooperate together. There are two things that Japan can actually provide. First one is diplomatic partnership that can facilitate bilateral and multilateral cooperation between Japan and the Pacific Island, which Japan is actually doing. And then secondly, economic and defense assistance tailored to their needs and requests. By doing so, Japan and the Pacific Island countries can foster mutual understanding, creating relationships that are not patron-client but equal partnership. This way, when the Pacific Island countries need to make the choice, they can do so independently, not depending on the great powers preference. In March 2024, when we actually see the JPIDD, the Defense Minister Kihara made a speech called the Cooperation Concept for United Security Efforts in the Pacific Island region, emphasizing the importance of centrality, unity, and ownership of the Pacific Island countries in determining their own regional order, as well as the equal partnership with the external states, including Japan. What Japan really needs to do is to sustain Japan's commitment and then follow through on its actual promises.
Euan, you said in your Adelphi book that cooperation between Australia, France, Japan, New Zealand, and the UK and the US will be essential to counterbalance China's influence in the region. How can these countries work together to do this, do you think?
There are existing channels for them to work together. The importance of humanitarian disaster relief is a very significant common denominator in which those countries have military assets, lift assets in sea lift and aircraft that can all be useful, provided that there is an element that's provided of local participation from the Pacific Island countries. I think we've seen some collaboration on submarine cables, which is very significant. with the Palau Spur, I think, already complete, in which Japan, US, and Australia came together, and a slightly different consortium involved in the ongoing submarine cable to Tuvalu. But I think that also does include Australia and Japan. And those are real crown jewel assets. France, I think we have to be realistic, is going to be preoccupied with internal security in New Caledonia for the foreseeable future. So its ability to participate in those external facing initiatives is probably going to be constrained. And that makes it even more important that a partner like Japan can be persuaded to step in to help fill the mix, and not only to think that its equities are in the north of the Pacific. I think there are things that Japan can very usefully do in Melanesia, even though Australia is still the leading security provider.
And France, of course, also has a lot going on domestically as well, politically, which may also sap policy bandwidth a bit, to your point, Euan. Thank you for your fantastic discussion on the Pacific Islands and the strategic issues around them. We're now on the moment where we have our Japan memo questions, and we ask all our guests the same question, and we have had some fantastic answers, quite eclectic answers as well. So hoping for great things from you three as well. The first question is whether you have any book recommendations for listeners who wish to understand Japan better. You can interpret this very broadly, and you are allowed to nominate your own books as well. And then second question is, what do you think people often get wrong about Japan? Kei-san, if we could start with you, please.
Thank you so much. I have two books to recommend. They are still in progress and forthcoming, so probably it will be published next year, 2025, but I would like to recommend them anyways. One is a book called Asia's Graying Security: Strategies of America's Aging Allies, Adversaries, and Partners by Professor Andrew Oros from the Washington College. The book discusses how demographic change affects the strategic relationship between the United States and Japan, as well as between the US and its partners in the Pacific region. We often talk about the economic implications of the demographic change in Asia and in the Pacific, but we don't go deeply enough to its strategic implications. So obviously this is a very challenging task, but Andrew addresses it in a very intelligent manner and making this book highly recommended. Another one is my co-authored book, the tentatively titled Japan as a Liminal Power: Evolving Grand Strategies from Meiji to Reiwa, which I'm working on with Professor Saori Katada from the University of Southern California. This book has two assumptions. First one is Japan is a liminal power, always internationally in between in terms of material capabilities, international status, and geographical position. And secondly, Japan has invented several grand strategies since the Meiji era, although they were not necessarily successful. Based on these assumptions, we examine the relationship between the different types of Japan's liminality and its grand strategies. We analyze the historical development of these grand strategies and then discuss the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So please stay tuned. And the second one, what do people usually misunderstand Japan? I'm actually least confident about this question because I have lived outside Japan for more than 15 years. I might be the one who misunderstands Japan. Living in Southeast Asia, I often hear opinions that Japan is not independent enough as a nation state due to its strong relations with the United States. And as many developing and emerging countries emphasize their agencies, but like Japan has actually agency and has made different strategic decisions at the both global and regional level. For example, like free and open in the Pacific is one of the most prominent examples that we can actually look at. In order to understand Japan more deeply, I believe that this initiative by Japan should be worth paying close attention to.
Excellent. So we've got two books to look forward to. It'll keep us going to next year. So thank you for those, Kei. Hideyuki, books and what people get wrong.
My recommendation for the question one is a book called Hagakure. It is a book to understand the meaning of life. When I work overseas, I feel the mentality of Japanese, not based on, but related to that book. But that book is very long, so I recommend to find any guidebook kind. Second book is, this is also different from security or those kinds, but Hibi Heian by Yamamoto Shugoro. You also can find the mentality of ordinary Japanese through that book. I think many people will think Japanese are very kind to visitors. Sometimes not so much. when you step in the jam-packed train in the morning, you can find the real situation. そう。Thank you.
Well, I just recommend the London Underground at rush hour. I'd still prefer to be in the Tokyo Metro at rush hour. At least you have air conditioning. But thank you for those two book recommendations, sort of more cultural context there. And for our listeners, we will put all the book recommendations in the show notes. And we'll also do a roundup at the end of the year of all the books that all our guests have recommended. So you'll be able to get a full list all in one place as well. So thank you, Hideyuki. Finally, to Euan, please.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to embarrass myself because you've already very kindly mentioned my book a couple of times. But given that this is an IISS podcast, I could not do otherwise than to flag my own modest contribution to the Adelphi series, which is called Australia's Security in China's Shadow, which I was rereading to crib from my own chapter on the Pacific. So there is some Pacific relevance in there, but mainly because it was so damned hard to write. I think I probably did 2 or 3 books worth of effort to distill into that final edited version. And there were some battles to get it over the line, but persistence won out in the end. I'll let your readers be the judge of the quality. On what do people get wrong about Japan? Well, my inner historian nerd wants to give an answer to that that's relevant to the Pacific from Japan's own history. A lot of the history assumption is that because of the dominance of the Second World War, people just assume that that was Japan's entree into a lot of the Pacific Islands, and indeed in the South it was. But often overlooked is the fact that Japan, as a result of being one of the Allied victors in the First World War, then became a mandate in large parts of Micronesia, including what is today Palau, the Martian Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, from about 1920 right through until the end of the Second World War. That's quite a significant period of time, and it's a rather understudied one. I'd like to know more about it myself. So maybe if there's a second book recommendation, it would be for someone to write about that. I think it's a very interesting period in Japan's colonial history, one that's understudied, but one that also gives it firmer roots into that particular part of the Pacific that a lot of people are not aware of.
Thank you, Euan. And I think I can see Hideyuki and Kei, their minds whirring as to possible next book projects, as perhaps that's going to be on their lists. So thank you very much, Kei, Hideyuki, and Euan, for a really good discussion on this really important bit of the world. To our listeners, please do check our guests out and follow them on X, and the details of how to do so will be on the show notes, so do consult those. And thank you also to our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us by email on japanchair@iiss.org. That's japanchair, all one word, @iiss.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, which we hope you did, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. For more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair program and the IISS more broadly on our website. Thank you to our guests again, and thank you to our listeners, and see you next time. Goodbye.